I never thought New Year's Eve would leave me with a memory I'd carry to my grave. What should have been a night of celebration turned into something I still can't explain, something that chills me to the bone every time I think about it. It all started when my friends and I decided to rent an old cabin deep in the woods to ring in the new year. The place was cheap, suspiciously cheap, but none of us cared. We were young, broke, and looking for an adventure. The photos online made the cabin look quaint, even charming, with a rustic fireplace and a large deck overlooking a frozen lake. What the photos didn't show was how desolate and unsettling it felt in person. When we arrived, the sun was setting and the snow-covered landscape was eerily quiet. The air was so still, it felt like the world had been put on mute. As we unpacked the car, I noticed the cabin's windows were fogged over, as though it had been holding its breath for our arrival. That should have been the first warning sign, but we brushed it off. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. There were odd details we hadn't noticed in the photos, deep scratches on the wooden floor, a few broken boards in the ceiling, and a peculiar old mirror hanging above the fireplace. The mirror was ornate, with an intricately carved frame that looked out of place in such a humble cabin. It gave me the creeps, but my friends laughed and called me superstitious. I decided to ignore it. As the night wore on, we cooked dinner, played music, and drank. Everything felt normal until around 10 p.m. when the power went out. It was sudden. No flicker, no warning, just complete darkness. We fumbled around for flashlights and candles, joking nervously about how this was the beginning of every horror movie ever made. Deep down, I think we were all a little uneasy, but none of us wanted to admit it. With the fire roaring, we decided to tell ghost stories to pass the time. It was fun at first, but then the atmosphere shifted. As one of my friends, Jenna, was halfway through a story, we heard a loud thump upstairs. Everyone froze. The cabin was supposed to be empty except for us. Probably just the wind, said Chris, the skeptic of the group, though his voice lacked conviction. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the stairs. I'll check it out. The rest of us waited in tense silence. When Chris came back down, he looked pale. There's nothing up there, he said, but his eyes darted nervously to the dark staircase. Maybe an animal got in. We tried to shake it off, but the uneasiness lingered. Midnight was approaching, so we poured drinks and tried to focus on the countdown. We stood in a circle by the fireplace, laughing a little too loudly, trying to drown out the anxiety that had taken hold. When the clock struck 12, we shouted, "Happy New Year," and clinked our glasses. That's when the mirror above the fireplace cracked loudly. The sound was sharp and sudden, like a gunshot. We all jumped, staring at the spiderweb of fractures spreading across the glass. Must be the heat from the fire, someone mumbled, but none of us believed it. Then we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs. They weren't the creaks and groans of an old house settling. These were heavy, purposeful steps, moving across the floor directly above us. "Who's up there?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. We were all frozen in place, too scared to move. Then the footsteps stopped, and a chilling silence filled the cabin. Chris, trying to be brave, grabbed a fireplace poker and gestured for me to follow him. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't let him go alone. We crept up the stairs, every step feeling like a death sentence. At the top, the hallway stretched out in front of us, dark and foreboding. The air was freezing, colder than it should have been, even with the power out. We checked each room, finding nothing but dusty furniture and shadows. When we reached the last room, the door was ajar. Chris pushed it open with the poker, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, except for the mirror. Another mirror, identical to the one above the fireplace, stood in the corner. I swear it hadn't been there before. Chris shone his flashlight on it, and we both gasped. The reflection didn't match the room. It was as if the mirror showed a different version of the space, darker and more decayed. And then we saw it, a figure standing in the reflection, staring back at us. It was a woman, her face pale and hollow, her eyes black voids. She was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. But when we turned around, there was no one there. We bolted downstairs, breathless and terrified. "We need to leave," I said, but the others hesitated. They didn't want to drive in the snow at night, and part of them still thought it was some kind of prank. That's when the banging started. It came from all around us, on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It sounded like fists pounding, desperate and angry. The fire in the fireplace went out, plunging us into darkness. Jenna screamed, and I felt something cold brush against my arm. We ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut. Panic set in as the banging grew louder, more frantic. Then, over the noise, we heard a whisper, a woman's voice, low and guttural. "Stay with me," it said. I don't know how we got the door open, but we did. We stumbled out into the snow, running to the car without looking back. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was dark and still, but in one of the windows, I saw her, the woman from the mirror, watching us leave. We didn't talk much on the drive home. No one wanted to acknowledge what had happened. When we got back to town, I looked up the history of the cabin. It turns out it belonged to a widow who lived there in the early 1900s. She was rumored to have been a recluse, dabbling in dark rituals after her husband died. She vanished one New Year's Eve, and her body was never found. Locals claimed her spirit lingered, angry at anyone who disturbed her solitude. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I can't explain what we saw and heard that night. None of us have spoken about it since, and we certainly haven't been back. Every New Year's Eve, I can't help but think of that cabin, of the woman in the mirror, and I wonder if she's still waiting for someone to join her.
Story number 2.
I've always loved New Year's Eve. There's something magical about saying goodbye to the old year and welcoming the new, filled with possibilities. But this time, I wish I had stayed home. If I had known what would happen, I would have never stepped foot into that cursed house. It started with an invitation. My coworker Melanie had rented an old Victorian house for a New Year's Eve party. She bragged about how it had been listed on a paranormal website as one of the most haunted houses in the state. I thought it was a joke, a clever marketing ploy. I even laughed when she told us about its nickname, the Widow's Rest. "Come on," Melanie had said, grinning. What better way to start the year than with a little ghost story? By the time I arrived, the party was already in full swing. The house was massive, with a grand staircase and high ceilings. Candles flickered in every corner, casting long, eerie shadows. The walls were lined with faded portraits of stern-faced people whose eyes seemed to follow you. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was alive and watching us. But I ignored the feeling, chalking it up to the atmosphere. After all, it was just an old house, right? Around 11:30, Melanie gathered everyone in the parlor for a ghost story. She told us the legend of the Widow Gray, who had lived in the house in the 1800s. According to Melanie, the widow lost her husband and 2 children in a fire. Overcome with grief, she became a recluse, spending the rest of her life searching for a way to bring them back. She was said to practice dark rituals, Melanie said, lowering her voice for dramatic effect. People claimed they heard whispers coming from her house at night, saw strange lights in the windows, and when she died, her body was never found. The room fell silent. Someone laughed nervously, breaking the tension, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After the story, Melanie dared us to explore the house. "See if you can find the Widow Gray," she teased. Most of the guests stayed downstairs, but a few of us decided to venture upstairs. The upper floor was darker, colder. The air smelled faintly of burnt wood, though no one else seemed to notice. We found a locked door at the end of the hall. It felt colder near that door, like standing next to an open freezer. Melanie had given me a set of old keys, so I tried a few until one clicked. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dusty room. At first, it looked like any other storage space. Boxes, old furniture, cobwebs. But then I saw it, a small wooden table in the center of the room, surrounded by melted candles. On the table was an open book, its pages covered in strange symbols. "Okay, this is officially creepy," muttered one of my friends. As I stepped closer, I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me toward the table. I picked up the book, and that's when the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and I heard a faint whisper. It wasn't one voice, it was many, overlapping and murmuring. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. Then the candles in the room flickered to life, though no one had lit them. "What the hell?" someone shouted, and we all turned toward the door. It had slammed shut. Panic set in. We tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers became a deafening chorus, filling my head. I felt a presence behind me, cold, heavy, and malevolent. When I turned around, I saw her. The Widow Gray was standing in the corner of the room, her face pale and hollow, her eyes black pits of nothingness. She was wrapped in a tattered, soot-stained dress, her hands skeletal and reaching out toward me. "Get out!" she shrieked, her voice echoing unnaturally. The lights flickered violently, and the room felt like it was spinning. I don't remember how, but we finally got the door open and bolted down the stairs. When we reached the parlor, the other guests were standing frozen, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" Melanie whispered. We nodded, too shaken to speak. At the stroke of midnight, the entire house seemed to groan, as if it were alive. The chandelier above us swung wildly, though there was no wind. Glasses shattered, and the candles extinguished all at once, plunging us into darkness. That's when I felt her touch, a cold, clammy hand brushing against my neck. I screamed and ran out the front door, not stopping until I was outside. We all left that night, leaving the house abandoned once more. I don't know what we disturbed, but I've never been the same since. Every New Year's Eve, I feel that cold touch, hear those whispers, and see her face in my dreams.
Story number 3.
New Year's Eve has always been a bittersweet holiday for me. I'm not a fan of crowds or loud celebrations, so I usually opt for something quiet. That year, I agreed to house sit for my friend Rachel. She and her husband had gone to a party out of town and needed someone to keep an eye on their remote property. The house was a modern cabin nestled in the woods about 30 minutes from the nearest town. It was peaceful, secluded, and honestly a little too isolated for my taste. But Rachel promised me there was nothing to worry about. "We don't get much wildlife," she said when handing me the keys. "And the house has great security. Just relax and enjoy the night." It sounded simple enough. I brought snacks, some movies, and my laptop to keep myself entertained. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through social media. Outside, the snow had begun to fall lightly, blanketing the ground in white. Around 10:30, the power flickered. I glanced up from my phone, frowning, but it came back on almost immediately. "Probably the weather," I muttered to myself. But then I heard it, a soft knock on the front door. It was faint, almost hesitant, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response. I got up and peeked through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. My heart started to race. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and Rachel hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. Another knock. This time it was louder and more insistent. I hesitated, then decided to turn on the porch light. When I did, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the snow, leading up to the door, but no one was there. I locked the deadbolt and backed away, grabbing my phone to call Rachel. As I dialed, I heard another sound. A soft scratching, like nails on wood. It was coming from the back door. I froze. The phone slipped from my hands and hit the floor. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something or someone was trying to get in. I crept toward the back door, my heart pounding in my ears. When I peeked out the small window, I saw nothing but the snow-covered deck. No footprints this time, no sign of anyone. But the scratching continued. Suddenly, the porch light flickered and went out. I gasped and stumbled backward. That's when I noticed the silence. The scratching had stopped. And then the knocking started again. This time it was coming from every direction. The front door, the back door, the windows, loud, rapid banging that echoed through the house. I covered my ears and screamed, "Who's there? What do you want?" The banging stopped. In the deafening silence that followed, I heard a faint whisper. It was coming from the living room. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. When I stepped into the living room, I saw it. A single, fogged handprint smeared across the inside of the window. I ran for the front door, grabbing my coat and boots on the way out. I didn't care about the snow or the freezing temperature. I just needed to get away. As I fumbled with the lock, I felt a cold breath against the back of my neck. A voice whispered, "Don't leave." I screamed and threw the door open, bolting outside. I ran down the snowy driveway toward my car, but when I reached it, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Written in the snow on my windshield were 2 words, "Stay here." I didn't even think. I jumped in the car, started it, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I reached the main road. When I told Rachel what had happened, she didn't believe me at first. But when she got home, she found the same handprint on the living room window, and more footprints circling the house. They sold the property a few months later. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I'll never spend another New Year's Eve alone.
Story number 4.
New Year's Eve is supposed to be a time of celebration, but for me, it's a night I wish I could forget. Every year I try to convince myself it didn't happen the way I remember, but the nightmares remind me that it did. It was a tradition among my friends to rent an Airbnb in a new city every year for New Year's. That year, we chose a small, historic town in Pennsylvania, known for its charming cobblestone streets and centuries-old architecture. We found a house that looked like something out of a postcard. 2 stories, colonial style, with large windows and a wraparound porch. When we arrived, the house felt off. It wasn't the creaky floors or the faint smell of mildew. It was the atmosphere, heavy and cold, even with the heat on full blast. But we brushed it off, chalking it up to the house's age. There were 6 of us, me, my best friend Ellie, her boyfriend Jake, and 3 others. We spent the evening playing games, drinking, and laughing. By 11:30, we were in high spirits, ready to count down to midnight. Then the power went out. It was sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the candles we had lit earlier for ambiance. At first, we thought it was a blown fuse or a weather issue. Jake grabbed his phone to use as a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. "Anyone else's phone dead?" he asked, holding up the useless device. We all checked, and the answer was the same. Every phone, every electronic device was completely unresponsive. "Maybe it's a blackout?" Ellie suggested, though her voice wavered. We decided to check the breaker box in the basement. Jake and I volunteered, while the others stayed in the living room. The basement door was at the end of a long, narrow hallway. As we approached, the temperature dropped, and I swear I heard faint whispers, like voices just out of earshot. "Do you hear that?" I asked Jake, my breath visible in the icy air. "Hear what?" he said, his voice strained. When we opened the basement door, a wave of freezing air hit us. The steps creaked loudly under our weight as we descended. The basement was unfinished, with exposed brick walls and dirt floors. The breaker box was in the far corner, but as we walked toward it, the whispers grew louder. "Who's there?" Jake called out, shining the dim light from his lighter around the room. No response. As we reached the breaker box, I noticed something scratched into the wall beside it. "Leave now." The letters were jagged, as if they'd been carved with something sharp. "Jake," I whispered, pointing to the wall. Before he could respond, the lighter flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind us. When we returned to the living room, the others were huddled together, their faces pale. "What happened?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Before we could answer, a loud banging erupted from upstairs, like someone stomping across the floor. We all froze, staring at the ceiling. "Is someone else here?" one of our friends whispered. "No," I said, my throat dry. "We're the only ones." The banging grew louder, more frantic, shaking the entire house. Then it stopped. Silence. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending the staircase. We stared at the stairs, too terrified to move. A shadow appeared at the top, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. It stopped halfway down the stairs, its head cocked to the side as if observing us. Then it spoke in a voice that wasn't human. "Get out," it rasped, the words echoing unnaturally. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran out into the freezing night, leaving everything behind. The next day, we returned to retrieve our belongings. The house felt different, still eerie, but quiet. We packed quickly, not daring to stay longer than necessary. Before leaving, I glanced back at the staircase. The shadow was gone, but carved into the wooden railing were the words, "See you next year."
Story number 5.
I never thought a New Year's Eve party could turn into the most horrifying night of my life. It was supposed to be simple, a small gathering with close friends at a house my cousin rented through a friend of a friend. The house itself was strange, a Victorian-era relic perched on a hill outside of town. It had been abandoned for years before the current owner decided to fix it up and rent it out for events. We arrived around 8 p.m., carrying drinks, snacks, and the usual party supplies. The house was massive, with high ceilings, ornate moldings, and walls that seemed to absorb sound. As we walked through, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The first strange thing happened around 9:30. One of the guys, Mark, went upstairs to find the bathroom. When he came back down, his face was pale, and he looked shaken. "Are you okay?" I asked. "There's something wrong up there," he muttered, glancing toward the staircase. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then said, "I heard someone whispering my name, but no one was there." We laughed it off, assuming he'd had too much to drink already. but Mark wasn't the type to scare easily. By 10 p.m., the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavy, and the house had grown colder, despite the roaring fireplace. I noticed that the music from our speaker seemed quieter, almost muffled, like the walls were swallowing the sound. Around 10:45, one of the girls, Emily, suggested we play hide and seek. It seemed juvenile, but after a few drinks, it sounded like fun. We turned off most of the lights, leaving only a few candles burning, and began. I hid in a closet on the second floor. It was cramped, filled with old coats that smelled of mothballs and dust. As I crouched there, I heard faint footsteps outside the door. "Found you," I called, assuming it was someone looking for me. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but no one opened the door. Then, just as I was about to step out, I heard a soft, raspy whisper from behind me. "Stay hidden." I spun around, but the closet was empty. My heart pounding, I burst out of the closet and ran back downstairs. When I got to the living room, everyone was there, except for Emily. "Where's Emily?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. "She's still hiding," someone said. We waited for a few minutes, calling her name, but there was no response. Finally, we all started searching the house. We found her upstairs, standing in the corner of one of the bedrooms, facing the wall. "Emily?" I said cautiously, stepping closer. She didn't respond. Her shoulders were stiff, and her hands hung limply at her sides. When I touched her shoulder, she turned slowly, her face blank and her eyes unfocused. "Emily, are you okay?" She blinked a few times, then whispered, "It told me to stay." "What told you to stay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the corner where she'd been standing. There was nothing there, just an old wooden rocking chair, but the chair was moving, creaking back and forth as if someone had just gotten up. We didn't wait to find out what was going on. Grabbing our coats and keys, we ran out of the house, leaving everything behind. As we piled into our cars, I glanced back at the house. In one of the upstairs windows, I saw a shadowy figure watching us, its head tilted to the side, as if curious. The next day, we tried to contact the owner to explain what had happened. But when my cousin called, the man on the other end of the line said, "What house? I don't own any property like that." When we drove back to check, the house was gone. All that was left was an overgrown lot and the remnants of a crumbling foundation.
Story number 6.
I'll never celebrate New Year's Eve the same way again. Every time the clock strikes midnight, I think about what happened that night and wonder if I'll ever be free from it. It started with an invitation from my friend Sarah to join her at her family's cabin deep in the woods of Vermont. "It's rustic, but cozy," she had said, her voice laced with excitement. "Perfect for ringing in the new year." I was hesitant at first. The idea of being miles away from civilization during the dead of winter didn't exactly appeal to me, but Sarah was persuasive. She assured me it would be a small, relaxing gathering, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of city life. We arrived on December 30th, just before sunset. The cabin was charming in a way, with its stone fireplace, wooden beams, and large windows overlooking the forest. But it felt isolated, too isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the dense trees surrounding the cabin seemed to swallow all sound. That night, as we sat by the fire, Sarah told us about the cabin's history. "It used to belong to my great-uncle," she said, sipping her wine. "He lived here alone for years after his wife disappeared. They say she just walked into the woods one day and never came back." Her boyfriend, Eric, chuckled nervously. "That's comforting. I'm serious," Sarah continued. "The locals think the woods are haunted. That's some old legend about a woman in white who lures people away." We laughed it off, calling it a silly ghost story, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. The next day, New Year's Eve, we spent the morning exploring the snowy woods. The silence was eerie, broken only by the crunch of our boots. By afternoon, the sky had turned a steely gray, and a biting wind swept through the trees. When night fell, we gathered inside for dinner, drinks, and games. By 11:30, we were counting down the minutes to midnight, the cabin filled with laughter and music. But just as the clock struck 12, the power went out. At first, we thought it was a typical outage, but when Eric tried to check his phone for service, it was dead. All of our devices were. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking his phone as if that would fix it. The cabin grew colder, the fire flickering weakly as if struggling to stay lit. Then we heard it, a faint knock at the front door. "Who would be out here at this hour?" Sarah whispered, her face pale. Eric grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. There was no one there, just the empty, snow-covered forest. Probably the wind, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He closed the door, but as soon as he did, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. "I'm not opening it again," Eric said, stepping away. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. "Is someone messing with us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We huddled together, listening as the footsteps moved around the cabin, stopping at each window. Through the frosted glass, I thought I saw a shadowy figure, but when I wiped the fog away, there was nothing. Then we heard it, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, coming from the woods. "Come outside," she called. "It's beautiful out here." Sarah gasped, clutching my arm. "That's her," she whispered. "The woman in white." I wanted to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the voice was unnatural, echoing in a way that made my skin crawl. Eric, trying to be brave, shouted, "Who's out there? Show yourself!" The voice laughed, a sound that was both alluring and chilling. "Don't you want to see me?" Suddenly, the front door burst open, the freezing wind howling through the cabin. In the doorway stood a figure, draped in white, her face obscured by a veil. She didn't walk, she glided, her feet never touching the ground. "Leave us alone," Sarah screamed, but the woman didn't respond. She raised a hand, and the temperature plummeted even further. Then, one by one, the candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. Sarah sobbing, Eric yelling, the sound of footsteps chasing us as we fled into the snow. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, Idretta gasping for breath as we piled in and sped away. When we looked back, the cabin was dark, but in the upstairs window we saw her, watching us, her veil fluttering in the wind. The next morning we returned with the police, but when we arrived, the cabin was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, as if it had never been there at all.
Story number 7.
I've never been superstitious. New Year's Eve was always just a night to party, make resolutions I'd never keep, and count down to midnight with friends. But after what happened 3 years ago, I dread this time of year. It was supposed to be a low-key night. My friend Claire had invited a few of us to her parents' old farmhouse in rural Illinois. It was the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the only sounds at night were the wind and the occasional cry of a coyote. There were 5 of us. Me, Claire, her boyfriend Ben, and our friends Liz and Jason. We arrived at the farmhouse around 7 p.m., hauling bags of snacks, drinks, and a small speaker for music. The house was cozy but dated, with creaky wooden floors, dim lighting, and a fireplace that gave off more smoke than heat. By 10 p.m., we were deep into a card game, laughing and teasing each other. Liz suggested we play a drinking game, but Jason, ever the thrill-seeker, had a different idea. "Let's try summoning something," he said, grinning. Claire groaned. "Jason, not this again." "What? It's New Year's Eve. What better time to connect with the spirits?" Ben rolled his eyes. "You watch too many horror movies." Jason wasn't deterred. He rummaged through his backpack and pulled out a makeshift Ouija board he'd scribbled onto a piece of cardboard. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, setting it on the table. I should have walked out then, but curiosity and a few drinks got the better of me. We gathered around the table, placing our fingers lightly on a shot glass Jason had turned into a planchette. The room felt colder, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jason started with the usual questions. "Is anyone here with us?" At first, nothing happened. We exchanged amused glances, ready to call it quits, when the glass suddenly moved. "Very funny," Jason, Claire said, but he swore he wasn't doing it. "Who are we speaking to?" Jason asked. The glass slid to the letters EVA. "Eva, is that your name?" The glass moved. A chill ran down my spine. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. "Do you want something from us?" Liz asked nervously. The glass spelled out LEAVE. "That's enough," Claire said, pulling her hands away. But the glass didn't stop. It began moving on its own, faster and faster, spelling out nonsense words before shooting off the board and shattering against the wall. We all jumped back, our laughter replaced by silence. "It's just a stupid game," Ben said, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. Then we heard it, a faint knock on the window. We froze. The farmhouse was surrounded by fields. There shouldn't have been anyone outside. Jason grabbed a flashlight and headed to the window, but when he shone the light, all we saw was darkness. "Probably the wind," he said, but his face was pale. The knocks came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Stop messing around," Claire snapped, but Jason shook his head. "I'm not doing anything." Suddenly, the front door banged open, the cold night air rushing in. We all screamed as the door slammed shut on its own. "Who's there?" Ben shouted, but no one answered. We huddled together, every sound amplified in the silence, the creak of the floorboards, the distant howl of the wind, and then the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. "Did anyone go up there?" Liz whispered. We all shook our heads. The footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase. Jason, clutching the flashlight, aimed it toward the stairs. "Hello?" he called out. The beam of light caught something, a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and empty. She was dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in limp strands. She didn't walk. She floated down the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. "Get out!" she hissed, her voice a guttural growl that didn't match her frail appearance. We didn't wait for her to repeat herself. Grabbing our coats and keys, we bolted for the car, leaving everything behind. As we sped down the dirt road, Claire looked back and screamed. The woman was standing in the middle of the road, her eyes locked on us, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. When we reached town, we went straight to the police. They dismissed our story as a drunken prank. But the fear in our eyes must have convinced them to check the farmhouse. The next day, they told us the farmhouse had been empty for decades. No one had lived there since the previous owner, a woman named Eva, had been found dead in the upstairs bedroom.
Story number 8.
New Year's Eve is supposed to be a time of joy and fresh beginnings. But for me, it's a night etched in terror, a reminder of the time I came too close to something I can't explain, something I never want to face again. 3 years ago, my friends and I decided to rent a remote cabin in the mountains to celebrate the new year. It was a last-minute decision, and the options were slim, but we found one that looked cozy in the photos. It was cheap, and we didn't question why. The drive up was beautiful at first, winding through snow-covered forests. But as night fell, the roads became treacherous, and the GPS struggled to find a signal. By the time we arrived, the air was thick with tension. The cabin was much older than it looked in the pictures, with peeling paint and shutters that hung crookedly. It sat alone in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. Inside, it was dark and musty, the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. The furniture was dated, and the floors creaked with every step. But we were determined to make the best of it. After unpacking, we lit a fire, played some music, and started preparing for the night's festivities. By 10 p.m., the wind outside had picked up, howling through the cracks in the windows. We were in the middle of a card game when Liz, one of my friends, paused and frowned. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" I replied. "It sounded like a child laughing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We all froze, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, faintly, we heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle coming from outside. "Probably just the wind," Dan said, trying to brush it off, but his face was pale. Liz wasn't convinced. She got up and peeked out the window. "There's nothing out there," she said, but her voice was shaky. Trying to lighten the mood, we turned the music up and went back to our game. Midnight was approaching, and we poured drinks to toast the new year. But just as we started counting down, the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Someone cursed, and we fumbled for our phones to use as flashlights. That's when we heard it again. The laughter. Louder this time, and closer. "Okay, this isn't funny," Dan said, his voice tense. "Who's out there?" None of us had an answer. Gathering our courage, we decided to check outside. Armed with flashlights and a baseball bat Dan had found in a closet, we stepped into the freezing night. The snow was undisturbed, no footprints leading to or from the cabin. Yet the laughter continued, echoing through the trees. Suddenly, Liz screamed and pointed. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, a small child in a tattered dress, her head tilted to the side as if studying us. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and her eyes were impossibly black. "Come play with me," she said, her voice sweet but chilling. We didn't wait to see what she would do next. Dropping the bat, we bolted back inside and locked the door. Dan shoved a heavy dresser in front of it while Liz and I checked the windows. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from inside the walls. "I don't understand," Liz whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How is she out there?" Before we could answer, the fireplace roared to life, flames shooting up the chimney. In the flickering light, we saw her, standing in the corner of the room, her black eyes fixed on us. "Why won't you play with me?" she asked, her voice distorted, echoing unnaturally. We screamed and ran for the back door, abandoning everything. We didn't stop until we reached the car, piling in and speeding away without looking back. The next morning, we reported what happened to the rental agency. They seemed confused. We don't have a cabin in that location, they told us. When we insisted, they looked into it and called us back a few hours later. That property burned down 20 years ago, they said. A family lived there, parents and their young daughter. The parents died trying to escape the fire, but the girl was never found. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but every New Year's Eve, when the clock strikes midnight, I hear her voice in my dreams. Come play with me.
Story number 9.
I never believed in omens, but after what happened one New Year's Eve, I've come to dread the night as something far darker than a celebration of fresh beginnings. The year was 2018, and my friends and I had decided to do something unique, an overnight ghost tour at an old mansion known for its violent history. The place was called Holloway Manor, a sprawling, decrepit estate tucked away in the backwoods of Louisiana. It had been abandoned for decades, its last known residents, a wealthy family of 6, disappearing without a trace in the 1920s. Locals whispered about strange noises, shadowy figures, and an oppressive energy that seemed to seep from the walls. We were a group of 6, me, my boyfriend Eric, our friends Danielle, Mike, Sarah, and Chris. The tour guide was a wiry old man named Charlie, who looked like he'd seen one too many things he couldn't explain. "The house doesn't like visitors," he said as he led us inside. "Keep your wits about you, and whatever you do, don't go to the basement." I laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the show, but Charlie's expression didn't budge. The mansion's interior was a time capsule of decayed grandeur. Faded wallpaper, shattered chandeliers, and furniture cloaked in thick layers of dust. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wind felt amplified in the silence. We started the night in the dining room, where Charlie regaled us with tales of the Holloway family's demise. "No bodies were ever found," he said, his voice low. But neighbors reported hearing screams in the middle of the night and lights flickering in the windows long after the house was abandoned. It was unsettling, sure, but the drinks we'd brought helped take the edge off. By midnight, the atmosphere had shifted from eerie to playful as we dared each other to explore the manor. Danielle, ever the skeptic, suggested splitting up to see if anything spooky would happen. I didn't like the idea, but peer pressure won, and soon we were wandering the dark corridors in pairs. Eric and I ended up in what looked like a nursery. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled faintly of rot. A dusty crib sat in the corner, its mattress sunken and torn. A single rocking chair faced the window, gently moving despite the absence of wind. "Creepy," Eric muttered, pulling me closer. As we turned to leave, we heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. It wasn't coming from the hallway, but from inside the nursery. "Hello?" Eric called out, his voice shaky. The giggle turned into a soft humming like a lullaby. I grabbed Eric's arm, my heart pounding. "Let's go," I whispered. We bolted back to the dining room, where the others were already gathered, their faces pale. "Did you guys hear that?" Mike asked. "Hear what?" Eric replied, though I could tell he knew exactly what Mike meant. "Crying," Sarah said, her voice trembling. It was coming from the upstairs bedroom. Charlie had disappeared, and none of us wanted to admit how scared we were. Danielle, trying to lighten the mood, suggested we use the ghost hunting app on her phone. She claimed it was a joke, but the tension in the room made us all go along with it. We opened the app and held it out, watching as the radar scanned the room. A dot appeared on the screen, hovering right where the rocking chair had been in the nursery. "Who's there?" Danielle asked, her voice half laughing, half serious. The app's text feature lit up, spelling out a single word, "hungry." A chill ran through me. "Turn it off," I said. Danielle was about to, but before she could, the chandelier above us started to sway. The dusty crystals clinked together, and then, without warning, it crashed to the floor. We screamed, scrambling away from the shattered glass. The room went silent, but then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. They weren't coming from the hall or the stairs, but from beneath us. "The basement," Chris whispered, his eyes wide. "No," I said firmly, "we're not going down there." But the footsteps grew louder, as if whatever was below wanted us to know it was coming. Suddenly, the door to the basement flung open, revealing a yawning black void. The air that wafted up was icy and foul, like something long dead. We stood frozen, too terrified to move, until Danielle, in a burst of false bravado, stepped toward the door. "This is ridiculous," she said. "There's nothing down there." Before any of us could stop her, she descended the stairs. "Danielle, no," Sarah called out, but Danielle was already out of sight. We waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Then came the scream, a blood-curdling, soul-piercing wail that made my knees buckle. Eric grabbed my hand. "We need to leave. Now." But as we turned for the front door, it slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. Danielle's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from the basement, we heard her voice. "Guys, come down here. You have to see this." But it didn't sound right. Her tone was flat, almost mechanical, and there was something about the way she spoke, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. Chris took a step forward, but Eric held him back. "That's not her," he said. "Help me." Danielle's voice called again, softer this time. We didn't wait to find out what was down there. In a blind panic, we forced the front door open and ran into the freezing night, not stopping until we reached our cars. We never Charlie again, and when we reported the incident to the authorities, they claimed the house had been abandoned for years. They found no sign of Danielle, and no one could explain how we'd gotten inside when the property had been boarded up and condemned. I still hear her voice sometimes, late at night, whispering from the shadows. "Come down here. You have to see this."
Story number 10.
It was New Year's Eve, and for the first time in years, I wasn't out celebrating. I had always loved the energy of the night, the countdowns, the fireworks, the feeling of starting fresh. But this year was different. My best friend Lily had convinced me to spend it at her family's cabin in the woods. "It'll be fun," she said. "Just us and a few friends, away from all the noise." The cabin was about 3 hours outside the city, nestled in a dense forest. It was an old family property, built in the 1800s, and still had that rustic charm, complete with creaky floorboards and a massive stone fireplace. When we arrived, the air was cold, the sky darkening, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under our boots. It was peaceful but unnervingly quiet. By the time the others showed up, we had the fire roaring and snacks spread out on the coffee table. There were 6 of us in total. Lily, her boyfriend Mark, his younger brother Jamie, our friend Claire, and me. As the night wore on, we played board games, told stories, and sipped champagne, the warmth of the fire keeping the winter chill at bay. Around 11 p.m., Jamie suggested we tell ghost stories. At first, we laughed it off, but soon we were all huddled together, the lights dimmed, sharing tales of hauntings and urban legends. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I didn't have a story of my own, but I remembered something my grandmother had told me. "It's not a ghost story exactly," I began. But my grandma used to warn us about something she called the Year's Keeper. She said it was a spirit that wandered the earth on New Year's Eve, collecting souls to bring into the next year. If you were out too late or alone, it could find you and drag you away. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then Mark laughed, breaking the tension. "That's creepy," he said, "but I think we're safe here." At midnight, we cheered, toasted to the new year, and watched as fireworks lit up the distant horizon. The night felt magical, like nothing could go wrong. But that's when the strange things started happening. It began with the lights flickering. At first, we thought it was the old wiring, but then we heard it, a faint knock on the front door. We all froze. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. No one should have been out there. Mark, ever the brave one, got up to check. He opened the door, letting in a blast of icy air, but there was no one there. "Probably the wind," he said, shutting the door. But as he turned back to us, we heard it again, 3 deliberate knocks, louder this time. My heart was pounding as Mark swung the door open again. This time there were footprints in the snow, leading away from the porch and disappearing into the trees. "Is someone messing with us?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Mark and Jamie decided to go outside and check. They grabbed flashlights and coats, promising to be right back. The rest of us stayed inside, huddled together on the couch, our eyes glued to the windows. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. They didn't come back. "We should call them," Claire said, pulling out her phone, but there was no signal. The cabin's landline was dead too, the static on the line sending chills down my spine. We debated going after them, but none of us wanted to step into the dark. Then, the noises started. It sounded like footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. "No one's up there," Lily whispered, her face pale. We all knew it was true, but the sound continued, growing louder and closer. We grabbed whatever we could find, fireplace pokers, kitchen knives, and crept up the stairs. The hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms all closed. As we stood there, deciding what to do, one of the doors creaked open. Inside, the room was freezing, the window wide open, despite the fact that we had locked it earlier. On the bed lay Mark's flashlight, the glass cracked and the light flickering weakly. There was no sign of him or Jamie. The footprints in the snow outside the window confirmed what we feared. They had been in the room. But where were they now? As we backed out of the room, the door slammed shut behind us, and the sound of footsteps started again, this time downstairs. We rushed back to the living room, but it was empty. The front door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. Lily ran outside, calling for Mark, her voice echoing in the silent woods. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back before she could go too far. "We can't split up," I said, my voice shaking. "Whatever's out there, it's not them." The hours dragged on, each one more terrifying than the last. The noises continued. Knocking on the walls, whispers we couldn't understand, and that constant, deliberate sound of footsteps. The fire died out and the cabin grew colder, the chill seeping into our bones. By dawn, the noises stopped. The woods were silent again, but Mark and Jamie were still missing. When we finally worked up the courage to leave the cabin, the snow outside was untouched. The footprints from the night before gone. We called the police as soon as we reached the main road. They searched the area but found no trace of the boys. Their car was still parked by the cabin, their coats and boots left behind. It was like they had vanished into thin air. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind or some elaborate prank. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there, something that wasn't human. Every New Year's Eve, I think about them. About Mark's laugh, Jamie's grin, and the way they disappeared without a trace. And I wonder, did the Year's Keeper take them? Or are they still out there, wandering the woods, waiting for the next midnight to come?